Hello everybody, today we're going to be looking at the third chapter of the Transcendentals and their function in the Metaphysics of Duns Scotus by Allan B. Wolter. Today's episode is over the chapter Univocation and Transcendentality. So first we're going to start with a note on Scotus and Aquinas. There's a long-running debate about whether being is an analogical or a univocal term. And Aquinas is the most famous proponent of analogy, while Scotus is the most famous proponent of univocity, at least in scholastic debates. Now, most people take Scotus and Aquinas to be arguing with each other, or Scotus at least to be responding to Aquinas, but actually Scotus is primarily responding to Henry of Ghent and Augustine as represented by Henry of Ghent. So he's not actually attempting to combat Aquinas on any of these purposes. Okay. First, we have analogy and equivocity. Some people say, or some scholastic manualists would say, that analogy has a kind of unity of concept that's close but not exact. You could have two things, say finite being and infinite being, and while they're actually different things, they just appear similar to us, so we give them the same concept. And then the other kind of analogy is that of extrinsic attribution. This is usually called the analogy of attribution, where you'll have something like the predicate healthy, where a person is healthy, their urine is healthy, and food is healthy. They're all called healthy with reference to the person's health. That's the primary analogate. But that doesn't tell you about the constitution of the other things. It just tells you how they relate to that person. Okay, next we have a definition of univocity, something that possesses a unity or singleness of being. It cannot be affirmed or denied without contradiction, and it has sufficient unity to serve as the middle term of a syllogism. Here's an example of what it would look like if you used, say, the analogy of attribution in a syllogism as the middle term. Whatever is divine is God. The Mosaic law is divine, therefore the Mosaic law is God. Obviously, this is nonsense. The Mosaic law is only divine in reference to God, but there are two distinct meanings of the word divine here. One is in relation to God, and one is just God. So now we're going to outline the position of Henry of Ghent, which Scotus is responding to. So Henry thinks there are two kinds of being: indeterminable being and determinable being. And these are irreducibly different. They're not the same thing, but they appear the same to our mind. So we form a third idea, undetermined being. This is being that isn't actually proper to either of those two concepts. It's basically a nothing. And then indeterminable being will be infinite, that will be God, and determinable being will be finite, that will be created things. Okay, so what's the problem for Scotus here? Well, the problem is, where do we get our idea of infinity, of God? Is it a simple or a composite concept? Do we get it through simple apprehension, abstraction, or discursive reasoning? Well, some of the answers previously were illuminationism, innatism, or, well, the position of Socrates. Illuminationism would be that God takes the human intellect and raises it to an understanding. Innatism would be that God places an understanding directly in the intellect of infinite being. Or if you take a Socratic position, maybe it's something that you were familiar with before birth. So before you were born, you had a knowledge of infinite being, and then you just kept it. Scotus' solution is a little bit more complex. So for him, simple apprehension and abstraction produce simple concepts. Your idea of greenness comes from your experience of green things. But reasoning produces complex concepts. At the end of a chain of discursive reasoning is going to produce complex concepts. Well, God is arrived at through reasoning, so our ideas of God must be complex. He isn't directly placing a proper idea of him in our heads. Also, we would be totally incapable of reasoning to God if two or more predicates weren't possible. It wasn't possible to predicate two or more things of him, because, well, the end of a chain of reasoning is complex. And then to reach God, you must prescind from being's intrinsic mode while keeping the idea of being. So this is a little bit weirder. Being's intrinsic mode, if you think back to the analogy about beads on a string, there's a formal distinction between every bead, and there's a modal distinction in every bead. So that's being and its intrinsic mode. Yeah. And you have to remove the intrinsic mode to reach to God. And then there are three short arguments for univocity. First, the term being is unconnected either with finite or infinite. When I say being, you don't know if being is an infinite or a finite thing, but that just shows you that they can't possibly be the same, because if they could, then, it wouldn't even be possible for you to be unsure if being meant infinite or finite being. And then there's the reply of Henry of Ghent, but the ideas are just so similar that they look like that to us. The problem with that response is that, simply that it would be impossible to have any univocal knowledge of anything. Two green things could be actually totally different. They could just not be the same at all, but they would appear green to us. Like, we wouldn't have any univocal knowledge of anything. So that's going to lead to skepticism about univocal knowledge, which no one wants. The second argument is you couldn't produce a proper notion of substance or God based on the accidents in created beings. So the reason for this is because there would be nothing common between substance and accidents, or God and creatures in any way at all, which you're gonna want to avoid, because you won't know. It will be a literal nothing. There will be no actual concept in your mind of being in that way that would be proper to substance. You don't have an idea of substance then. And then the third argument is from the Pseudo-Dionysus on the divine name.